Is it possible that hospitals around the world, even right here in the United States, were murdering people and blaming their deaths on COVID-19? According to Ken McCarthy and a group of frontline medical staff, the answer to that troubling question is yes. We should first stipulate that the entire official response to COVID-19 was an exercise in corruption, official ignorance, and abject failure. We know, for example, that hospitals were encouraged to manipulate their data on COVID cases and were even given financial incentives for inflating death counts. Recently, we reported on a disturbing story from across the pond in England about claims that thousands of COVID patients were basically murdered by medical workers. It is not, therefore, inconceivable that something similar was occurring here in the United States. Was the COVID pandemic death toll as great as official sources state? Not according to one of the frontline nurses who blew the whistle on the abject corruption of the medical authorities during the pandemic. It was, as it often is, about money. And as if that wasn't enough, an entire cottage industry in big tech sprang up, centered around shutting down conservative voices like yours truly from sharing the absolute truth about what so many have rightly dubbed as the pandemic. In many cases, big tech firms were heavily invested in vaccine development. For example, one of the most prolific censors of conservative voices was Facebook, owned by Mark Zuckerberg. The Facebook creator and leader had invested a massive sum of money into GlaxoSmithKline COVID vaccine. So he had a financial incentive to censor widespread vaccine skepticism because otherwise his bottom line, his investments would have been hurt. In fact, at every turn during the pandemic, you see this horrible interplay between the forces of the global left and the elites and their insatiable greed. Money was valued more than people by the medical authorities, their big pharma partners, and the big tech types who have so much power over our national, international, discourse. Speaking of truth-telling in the face of corporate tyranny, we are now joined by the aforementioned Ken McCarthy. He's the author of What the Nurses Saw, as well as Kimberly Overton, that frontline nurse we just quoted, and respiratory therapist Mark Bishofsky. All three have been fighting for the truth about COVID, and all three are here to discuss what really happened and continues to happen. Thank you all three for being here. We appreciate you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for having us.
Ken, I'm going to start with you because you wrote the book, What Nurses Saw. I have heard personal horrific stories from patients, family members, about the kind of treatment they received and the fact that they did not feel that they were trying to get them better. And at worst, were actually trying to kill them. Tell us what the nurses saw.
Well, and I bet there are many thousands of listeners that can tell similar stories. What did the nurses saw? They saw the complete pointless and unnecessary change of traditional medical procedure. They saw the enforcement of protocols that made no medical or scientific sense and were enforced with an iron fist. Once you were declared a COVID patient, whether you had a symptom or not, if you had a positive test, you were put into an alternate reality of medicine. So for example, if somebody's got inflammation and a respiratory problem, the thing that you always do is give them inhalable steroids and anti-inflammatories. This is not controversial. This is not new. This is not untested. This is how medicine has always been. But if you were deemed a COVID patient in a hospital, you were denied those basic therapies. This right away, we have a problem, right? They also were very interested in pushing remdesivir, for which they were financially incentivized. This is a disease. This is it created disease. This is a drug that was that failed. It was originally designed for Ebola. If people can remember way back, they said that Ebola patients were dying of massive organ failure. Well, it turns out one of the adverse reactions to remdesivir is massive organ failure. So somehow this drug got resurrected, taken up from the grave, and it was the only treatment that Anthony Fauci and friends would allow. And they paid hospitals to administer it, not just one treatment, but for every course. And we have one record of one patient that was put through 3 separate courses of this organ-destroying drug. The next level, this was also financial incentivized, was the rush to intubate. And we've got the perfect person on the call
Yeah.
today with Mark to talk about the details of that. But basically, they were paid to intubate and they were paid to keep people on a vent for 96 hours or more. And I'll leave it up to Mark to talk about how lunatic that is. These things were unprecedented in medical history. They had no scientific basis and they defied all common sense. And they led to the death of, it looks like to me, hundreds of thousands of people, hundreds of thousands. And it all happened in broad daylight, except of course it didn't, because if you were a COVID patient, you were not allowed an advocate. There was no witness to what was done to you. And it sounds like your family member or one or more of them survived this. Some did, but a lot of people didn't.
I know that the intubation seemed like a death sentence, and that became pretty clear very early on, even for people like myself, Mark, who I'm not a respiratory therapist. I'm not a doctor. I'm a layperson, and I knew that once they moved to intubate, that was basically mostly the end. And as Ken said, you would be the perfect person to expound upon this practice.
Yeah, so I've been a respiratory therapist for 25 years, and very early on in my career, I went to these like hospital symposiums, and it was at university hospitals, a massive patient data set where it was declared in 1999, 2000 that when you intubate a patient, the mortality and morbidity increases by 25%. We know it's dangerous. It's not this benign procedure. They're putting a tube down through your trachea into your lungs. You need to be sedated and a lot of times paralyzed. You're introducing an infection risk. You're introducing all kinds of trouble with blood pressures, and it's just very, very dangerous. It's this cascade of trouble. And historically, you would only do it emergently. And this concept of early intubation or elective intubation was nonsense. I fought it very early on. I tried to stop, talk to these doctors, like, what are you doing? Just to give you an idea. So they were intubating people who were requiring essentially a negligent, like hardly any oxygen, 3 liters of oxygen. So if you're in the grocery store and you see an elderly lady walking around with her oxygen, she's probably wearing a couple liters of oxygen, very minimal amount. Well, they were intubating people when they would reach this small 3 liters of oxygen. There is so much you can do between that and intubation. You can provide an oxygen mask with more liters of flow. You can provide high flow oxygen system. You can provide non-invasive ventilation. And so this concept of early intubation, which has now been, even the corrupt white coats, as I call them, understand it was a stupid concept. But they continued doing it for months and months and months. And I know that many, many thousands, if not tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of patients died that would not have otherwise died had they been given proper treatment or even early treatment. I won't even get into the lack of ivermectin or hydroxychloroquine or a simple inhaled steroid like budesonide, which is proven to stop hospitalizations and the need for critical care. So, I mean, I knew this was a scam very early on, as early as January of 2020. I knew it was a scam, and one thing led to another, and I fought and fought and fought and fought, and the system is broken.
I know you just had to probably cringe when you saw those daily COVID briefings, and I remember sitting in those day in and day out, and the major focus on producing ventilators, right? They had to get ventilators out there. They were upset that they didn't have what they wanted in New York when there were people like you already out there saying this is the wrong way. This is not what we're supposed to be doing. And Kimberly, I noted at the top of the segment that you, along with Mark and Ken, feel like the numbers were inflated and attributed to COVID deaths, but it sounds to me like you saw people dying not from COVID per se, but it sounds like the treatment. Tell us about your experience.
Yeah, absolutely. So I am an ICU nurse. I worked throughout the pandemic, directly caring for COVID patients. And yes, they were telling us from the beginning that all of our patients were dying of COVID. But, I absolutely contend that this was not the case at all. These patients were dying of the complete and total medical mismanagement and medical malfeasance that was occurring in these hospitals. And, it started with as Ken stated, when they come into the ER and they have that COVID test done, they now have a bounty on their head. As soon as they have that positive COVID test, they have a bounty on their head. And, I started becoming uncomfortable with these medical protocols that we were using that really flew in the face of everything that we've ever done in healthcare. Starting with the remdesivir may be very uncomfortable if you understand that remdesivir is an antiviral medication. So it relies on some form of viral replication in order to be effective. Well, by the time that these patients were reaching us in the ER or in the ICU, they are already well past their replication phase of the virus. It's a respiratory virus. It is dead in 5 days. So they're already into the symptomatic phase, because if you remember, even if they had come in initially, they were sending them home. They were saying, well, you're good.
Yeah.
Don't do anything. Go home and come back when you can't breathe, or AKA when you're a prime candidate for a ventilator. So we were seeing that happen over and over again. But the remdesivir specifically had me asking questions, because we know that it has an increased rate of mortality and a decrease in renal function. And yet we had seen it given to patients who were already in renal failure. I saw it given to a patient who only had one kidney.
Wow.
So being is that it's not going to be effective, I started asking this question, I'm like, why do we continue to use this medication that is clearly doing more harm than good? And my bigger question was, why is the government financially incentivizing its use? So I continue to ask these questions, and it's funny because the WHO actually even recommended against its use at the time, because massive global studies had shown that it had little to no impact on these hospitalized patients. But, I ended up having to leave bedside nursing altogether. I had to walk away from a career that I loved, because we could not continue to watch our patients needlessly die, despite all of our best efforts. It was just remdesivir, ventilator, death.
And is that why so many nurses were compliant with the protocols, that they didn't want to lose their jobs? Because, the financial incentives do not really trickle down to the nurses, right? They're not the ones getting the money for the intubation or the remdesivir. But yet so many of them went along with it and even advocated for it. I mean, I heard nurses say, oh, no, this is the right thing to do.
Well, they certainly don't trickle down to staff nurses. But if you remember, travel nurses were getting about $10,000 a week. $10,000 a week, which I call, hush money. I could have very easily taken a travel assignment in an ICU in some of these hotspots, New York or Texas, and I chose not to for many different reasons. But understanding that $10,000, that's a week, that's a lot for a nurse. That's many than most physicians. That's more than most physicians. So it's a lot of money. So that could have played a role, certainly. And then the fear of losing their jobs. Many of these nurses have bills to pay. They have families to support. I still won't understand placing a paycheck over human life, but you can understand why people are not so forthcoming. But yeah, I mean, they were placing these patients on, again, remdesivir, dangerous, ineffective EUA drug at the time. Then they're ventilating them. They're pushing them for early intubation, as Mark stated. Early intubation, not because this patient is in distress, not because they are in respiratory failure, but in an attempt to contain the virus. If you understand that a ventilator is a closed loop system, once they're on that ventilator, it's a closed circuit. The virus is no longer disseminated in the air. So they were doing this in an attempt to protect the healthcare workers. It was never about the patient in the bed. And unfortunately, that's the most egregious thing I've ever seen in my 27 years in healthcare, because they did this knowing that approximately 80% of those patients that they placed on a ventilator were not going to make it off. So they did this. They were in effect signing their death warrant when they pushed this early intubation.
And that's what absolutely scares me, is that institutionally, I don't feel like there's any lessons or any concern to change practices. And so that's why we're continuing to cover this. Some may say, oh, it's over. Yes, but people have to know, because they will try this again, and you have to advocate for yourself and for your loved one. And I learned that in a big way. Thank you all, Kimberly, Mark, Ken, for coming and speaking out about it, and your courage to do so. And again, you can get Ken's book, What Nurses Saw, and we recommend you do. Thank you all. We appreciate your time.